All right. Well, as we jump into our discussion at the very end before, as we were, I guess, kind of finishing up looking at all of the English translations, if you recall, the last one that we looked at was, I believe, the Douay-Rheims version. And that was produced by whom? When you think of the Douay Bible, the Catholics. That was the Catholic attempt to say, hey, the Protestants are messing it all up. This is the way that it should be. And they very purposefully tried to keep things messed up. Even though some of it came out a little bit earlier, 1610 is when the very final publication of that came out, or I guess the initial with the final and complete. But really, the English translation of the Bible has been a process that began with really what individual? John Wycliffe. And then from there, we've talked about Tyndale, Coverdale, the Great Bible, the Matthew Bible John Rogers put out. Probably getting those two out of order. I think it was John Rogers, then the Great Bible, the Geneva Bible, which really became the main Bible in use, especially among what group of people? Remember, England's religious groups have been fractured into what two groups? Not really Protestants and Catholics so much at this point. Catholics there are some, but predominantly England at this point is a Protestant country. But the Protestants are split into, okay, the High Church, Anglican, and then on the other side, the ones who want to purify the church, the Puritans. So you have the Puritans on the one side, which are going to be the most closely associated to the Calvinists. They're the ones that put together the Geneva Bible, went to Geneva. They want to do away with anything and everything that looks Catholic and Popish. And yet the High Church, the High Anglican Church, are they doing away with anything that looks Catholic? No, it's basically, it just looks like the Catholic Church still. You still have bishops and priests and everything else. It's kind of the same, you just have a different head. They've broken off from the Roman Catholic Church. So this is causing consternation within the church in England. All of that is to set up what happens when you have a change in power. Most of the work that was done was during whose reign before, as far as English translations are concerned? Henry VIII. Most of the work, that's right, Isaac, was during the reign of Henry VIII. Who followed him? Who was the next monarch? Yeah, Aaron? Elizabeth I, yep. So when Elizabeth comes in, remember, she tried to be, she didn't lean one way or the other, and there really wasn't a whole lot of stuff that took place. She finally did have to come down on Catholics, as the case was, but there's not a whole lot of work translationally during her reign. However, when you have a transition of power, things are going to change. Elizabeth dies in March of 1603, and which one of her children was going to take over after her? Yeah, Aaron?
I'm thinking it would be James I of Scotland.
Okay, was that one of her children?
A relative, I'm certain. I'm not quite certain if it's her son, though.
Yeah, it was a trick question. Aaron nailed it. Good job, Aaron. That's exactly right. It's a trick question. She didn't have any children. She never married. That's why she is referred to often as the Virgin Queen, because she never actually married. She has no children. When they came to talk succession with her, as she was very much close to death, she said, they said, well, who should be the king? They offered some people. She said, no, a king should be king. And she was referring to James the Sixth of Scotland, I think. Yeah, I have it written down here somewhere. Yeah, James the Sixth of Scotland. And they didn't like that idea, so they came back the next day to ask her again, and she was so feeble, she couldn't even answer. And they said, do you want James to be king? And she wasn't able to answer. She couldn't speak, but she made a crown sign over her head to indicate, yes, make him king. She dies the next day. And then James the Sixth of Scotland becomes, as Aaron said just a second ago, James the First of England. This is now King James the First, and there was a lot of hand-wrangling that was going on in the religious community at the beginning of his time, because people didn't know exactly where he was going to be coming from. Bear in mind, who is his mother? Does anybody know? Not the Bloody Mary, but she is Mary. Yeah, Aaron?
Scots?
Yeah, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was the great-granddaughter, I think, unless I'm getting this incorrect, Henry VII. So there was at least bloodline that was there. And she had made at least advances to try to be an heir, tried to be the queen. They tried to put her on the throne, and none of them worked during Elizabeth's reign. Who was trying to do that? What faction of people within England would want Mary, the Queen of Scots, to be the queen? It's a religious group. What group of people wanted Mary, Queen of Scots, to be the Queen of England? Yeah, Aaron?
Catholics?
The Catholics. Mary was a Catholic. And so James is born a Catholic. And so there's a lot of people that are concerned that they're getting a Catholic on the throne. The thing is, he had a bad relationship with his mother, disavowed everything about her. He was not a Catholic. However, he's the Queen of Scotland. And in Scotland, does anybody know who, religious faction-wise, kind of runs the show there? They're not really Catholic. This would be more the stronger Protestants, which would be more closely related with the Puritans. And so a lot of people are concerned that he has been raised and taught by Puritans, and he's been leading a Puritan, basically, they've had the run of things in his reign, the Puritan type faction in Scotland. So they are concerned about this. If you're a high church Anglican, that he's going to come down and suddenly make this a Puritan-based religion. The fact of the matter, though, he was not a Puritan. Who does he favor, do you think, within his reign? Process of elimination. We've ruled out the Catholics. We've ruled out the Puritans. The high church Anglicans. He likes, and by the way, a lot of rulers do prefer that because that's kind of the best system for those who are in power in order to maintain their power. So he makes it very clear in his very first few days as king, he holds a religious conference. And in this religious conference, which is supposed to bring together all the people, he has all the main bishops and priests and a whole huge number of people from the high church Anglican side of things. And he also invited 4 very select Puritan individuals to be a part of this. So you can clearly see which way he leans from the very beginning. He called this conference because the Puritans had raised concerns about the church, how it's too much like Catholicism. They need to get rid of things that are popish, all kinds of things. And so he gives them their chance to say what they're going to say, even though the Puritans weren't actually at every part of the conference the way that the bishops and such were. But he ends the conference basically upbraiding the Puritans who are there and just kind of raking them over the coals for certain things, and really felt as if he put them in his place, or put them in their place. There is an interesting quotation from a guy, Sir John Harrington, who was Elizabeth's godson. Therefore, he was allowed to attend these proceedings. And he says this of James, that James talked much Latin and bid the petitioners, that is the Puritans, bid them away with sniveling. The bishop seemed much pleased and said, His Majesty spoke by inspiration. As if the Holy Spirit himself divinely gave King James the words that he needed in order to rake the Puritans over the coals. But this guy who watched it said, I wist, which means no, I know not what they meant, except that the Spirit was rather foul-mouthed. He was not impressed by the way that King James did this and said, no, he did not do it so well. But in the midst of all of this, I bring this up because there was one very important thing that was brought up in the midst of these discussions by the Puritans that actually took root. And it has a whole lot to do with our discussion tonight. So, anybody care to guess what it is that they suggested was needed? What's that? A new Bible, a new translation. They suggested that, and that stuck. So the Puritans complained that the official translations during the time of Henry VIII, they were still the main teaching Bibles, and they contained some problems, some corruptions, much of which in their discussion had to do with the way that the apocryphal books were used, and anyway, some of the marginal notes and things such as that. The bishops were quick to say, no, we're just fine. We have the bishop's Bible. It's as good as it can get. But if you remember, we had some problems with the bishop's Bible, right? It wasn't done well. There's no coherency from translator to translator. It's as if each person did their own thing. There wasn't an editor that did a good job of bringing it all together. James thoughtfully considered that this was a need. And here's the thing about King James that might get lost if you don't really know much about King James, like I didn't know much about King James before looking into this. He actually was a really good Bible scholar. He was well educated in a number of languages, including Hebrew and Greek and Latin. And he was gifted with Scripture. He'd studied, he'd grown up studying under scholars in the biblical languages. This is something that really struck a nerve with him. He was excited about the prospect of there being another translation. And at the same time, since the days that Tyndale did his work, through this time, there has been a lot more excitement about biblical languages. They've become more the norm. Greek and Hebrew and such at colleges such as Oxford and Cambridge. By this point in time, there's a fervor about knowing the languages, translating. Things that before had been repressed and put down, now in the open, people are inviting people to join in with this type of thing. There's a new spirit for all of this, which means things are better now than what they were before. There are a whole lot more scholars that know this information than there were back when they were translating the other Bibles. I mean, you've had now waves of scholars who've come through these colleges and who are now a whole lot more gifted in this way. Many more people who could be a part of the translation process. Great achievements have been made in Greek texts. The New Testament, the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, we're going to talk about this later. Because all we've talked about so far is Erasmus's Greek New Testament. There's been more that's happened since then as far as the Greek text is concerned. So, in the last 40 years since the Bishop's Bible has come out, that's been the major Bible for the Anglican Church. The Geneva Bible, which is the main Bible for the Puritans, was even older than that. It's been 40 years when there's been all kinds of great advancements and everything else. They say, we're ready. We're ready for a new Bible. So this really stuck with him. Now that there's a new king, he's learned in Scripture translation. He saw himself as kind of an expert in the field. He saw the need. This also provides an opportunity for him to do what with the divisions that are taking place within the church? Yeah. Maybe this is a project that he can use to bring them together and can actually reconcile the divisions within the Anglican Church, things that have happened. It would be done by the greatest scholars, and that would appeal to the Puritans because that's what they're all about. But it would also be given, it would have to be given with the approval of the bishops who would look over it. And so it would have to go through both the hands of the Puritans, the Anglican High Church, before it would be given royal approval. And this is the kind of project that really speaks to a guy's hubris if he's in that kind of position. And he has the opportunity to put his stamp, his name, on something that is a monumental project. And so this leads us then to the Bible version that does have his name on it, right? Although it's called the Authorized Version, but the King James Version. Let's talk about how the King James Version came about. This is the process that they use. The translation effort that they attempted really was meant to be unbiased. They took scholars from all fields, from the Puritan fields and the Anglican fields. All of them were involved, and they broke down the translation into 6 different groups. 2 groups at Westminster, and then 2 groups at Oxford, and 2 groups at Cambridge. And there are an awful lot of things that you can read about these groups and the people that spearheaded these groups. But the first Westminster Company, they were in charge of translating Genesis through 2 Kings. And this group was led by a guy named Lancelot Andrewes, who was a premier scholar of the day. The second Westminster Company did Romans through Jude. William Barlow was their group lead. The first Oxford company did the Gospels, Acts, and Revelation. Thomas Ravis was their group lead. Let's see here. The first Cambridge company did First Chronicles through the Song of Solomon. Edward Lively was their group lead. And then the second Cambridge company, they handled the Apocrypha with John Duport being their group lead. Now, the fact that these groups, each group, by the way, was comprised of both Anglican, High Church Anglican, and Puritan scholars. Now, some of them tended more heavily one way. I'm going to get these mixed up. I think Cambridge had a tendency to be Puritan, and Oxford had a tendency to be High Church Anglican, which means it's probably the other way around because I'm doing that from memory, and I probably remembered them incorrectly. But one of them had a bias. Generally, the teachers who were there and the students that they produced was Puritan. The other one was typically for Anglican. But each group had to have people from both sides taking care of the translation efforts. Up till now, all the translations that have taken place have been either one person or a small group of people, all from the same background. They had the same biases, they had the same thoughts, and in their marginal notes that they put in their Bibles, it was clearly evident what they thought about things. They would not only translate in favor of their belief system, but in their marginal notes, they would lay scathing rebukes on people who didn't agree with the way that they understood things. And so every Bible has had a major bias built into it that we've seen within the English translation. This is the very first time that it has been undertaken to create an unbiased translation, where everybody has to agree on this. And they have to agree because as they're doing the translation work, everybody who's doing translation work in the company is sharing with everybody else in the company. There's not just a single person who's doing the translation work. It is being peer reviewed by everybody else. And then when they're finished, their work then goes to the other companies so that they can look through their translation work and make sure there aren't any problems. And if they do find issues or problems with the translation, there are ways that they can go about to say, hey, this is a problem, this is an issue, and here's what needs to be done about it. In other words, this is going through so many hands and eyes that are looking to verify this translation as they are doing this work. This has never happened before. That's what makes the King James Version such a special translation, because it's being done in a way that is more about trying to get to the heart of the text than trying to back up whatever your feelings might be. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not suggesting that everybody before was simply trying to change the text. They were doing their best. But the volume, the number of people that are fact-checking each other, that are looking over each other's shoulders, that are doing quality control on this was absolutely crazy. There was no room for bias here. They're working together, providing checks and balances on this translation. In fact, it was done so well that when people would read through the King James Version, there was no way to tell who did what translation. You couldn't look at a spot and go, oh, well, I definitely know that was Lancelot Andrewes who did that part. Look, you can tell the style. And remember, that was the problem with the Bishop's Bible, is that everybody had their own style, their own way of doing things. There was no blending. This was done so well that you could not tell one section from another. Everything flowed. Everything was beautiful all the way through. And they had certain rules that they had to work with. In fact, they were given 15 rules. I'm not going to go through all 15 rules. Some of them, in fact, it's kind of fun to look. If you wanted to Google this, the wording is kind of bizarre on some of them, and that's just kind of the way that they wrote things back then. Others really had to do with various specifics to the translation, but these are some that I think are important for us to say, okay, I understand this. First of all, the number one, or one of the first rules that they gave, we are not trying to reinvent the wheel. This is not an opportunity for you to create a brand new translation. What they say is, we've got good translations that are already here. We're not trying, we don't want you to come up with fancy, weird wording on things just to be different, just to make it different. Just give us the best translation that you have. And they did that by using the bishop's Bible as the main source. They said, now obviously your main source is going to be your Greek and Hebrew texts. But as far as your word choice and word usage, you have the bishop's Bible right here, and you say, how did they translate this? Does it fit? Does it match? And if the bishop's Bible has a good translation, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to change it just for the sake of changing it or for the sake of with something new. Just use what they have. And if it doesn't, then go back to the other Bibles. Go back to the Geneva Bible. Go back to the Great Bible. Go back to the Coverdale Bible. Go back to even, Tyndale and Wycliffe. Go back to all of those and look at those. And we're going to talk about that more in just a second. Also, they were supposed to keep certain words, and this is a high church Anglican concept coming through here, such as church. Instead of translating church as congregation or assembly or something like that, they were supposed to maintain church. Charity was another one. So certain words like this. They do this because some of these words have just become the way that people talk. And they don't want to create a whole bunch of confusion by suddenly changing words that have become just standard parts of people's vocabulary as they refer to and talk about the Bible. Marginal notes, they said, are not for your commentary. Marginal notes are for cross-referencing and for you to put in times in which you say, this is what we chose, but this is also a way that this could be translated. Different words that might have been better, and they said, we want to leave it up to people to know. We're not telling them necessarily. We're giving the option for them to look into it for themselves. Marginal notes were not for you to bring your bias out in the midst of this. They were to use previous chapter divisions and things such as that. The spelling of names was to be standardized based on popular usage. You're not allowed to put Elijah's name differently because it sounds different in the Hebrew. Everyone says Elijah. Even if it's Eliyahu within the Hebrew, it's Elijah. Don't change it because that's how people know it. That's the common way that people understand this. Don't make dumb changes that will just simply confuse people. All right? So that was one of the things. We need a standardized name spelling based on popular usage. And any words that were added to give a phrase meaning were to be given a special typeset, kind of like italicizing, in order to mark them. And we talked about this before, right? I want to say it was at Geneva, I might be getting that wrong, also did that. And some of your translations, I'm sure, do that as well. that you have words that are italicized. That just simply means that there's no word-for-word companion within the Greek or the Hebrew. But in English, we need that word in there for the sentence to make sense. And so they would say italicize those. So these are some of the rules that were used, and a lot of it simply was to make sure that this was a fluid writing. And it wasn't supposed to just be the mark of a brand new thing, but that they understand they're building on a tradition that has already been in place as far as the English Bible is concerned. Because the translation was done by such a vast number of people from diverse background and biases, the translation was unlike anything that had really come before it. Which is crazy, I know. We said one of the rules was, hey, you're not supposed to recreate something new. That's exactly what happened, though. And it wasn't new in that it was just crazy different. But it's new because it was just that much better. You know, there's a story told of a younger preacher who was challenging the way that something was translated in the King James Version, and one of the translators happened to have been there listening and heard this guy say, well, this should be translated this way. And he sat the young man down and he said, you know, we considered that. We talked about that and 13 other ways that we could have translated this, and we ended up on the one that we did for this reason, this reason, this reason, and this reason. Because it was such a committee project with so many minds going into it, it's not just the whims of one person and how he thinks that it should be. Which, by the way, I'm just going to throw this out there. Anytime that you see me talk about the CSHB, right, Christopher Sean Huntley version, understand that's what's happening, is you are listening to me saying what I think, and a lot of times maybe the committee behind the ESV, CSB, or others, probably have a lot more information than what I have in their translation. Now, they're still wrong from time to time, and I'm still right, of course, naturally. But just remember that. It's not always the case. When I do that, don't take what I'm saying as my saying, hey, I'm right, and they're absolutely wrong. But just usually when I say that, it's I really think that this makes more sense, and here's why. But always take it with a grain of salt. Translating committees that aren't just a single person doing a translation, they have so much input that's a part of it. It is an absolutely beautiful thing to try to get what we should have, or the best translation that we can have. It took 6 years for them to do their translation. It was completed by 1608, it had gone through all the minor peer reviews, so then they had to send their work to be, I guess, given translational challenges that would take place. Here are some things that I think it's really important for us to know about this. Even though it was built on the Bishop's Bible, it was also built on the Geneva Bible, the Great Bible, the Matthew Bible, Coverdale Bible, Tyndale, Wycliffe. We said this before, and I've tried, as we've gone through and looked at all those different Bibles, I've tried to point out, because the book that I'm using, Wide as the Waters, points out quite frequently phrases that have survived and are still in our vocabulary that come from all of these old Bibles. The ones that were there before, they used them. The translators took many of the phrases, the good ones, the ones that still capture our attention, that still roll off our tongue today, they gave them a place of permanence. If it was a good turn of phrase for that translation, and it worked, and it sounded good, they brought it in. At the same time, they took phrases that were almost good and reworked them slightly, and oftentimes giving them just the right change in order to create some kind of melodic creation. The King James Version of the Bible is a work of art. It is beautiful. It is sonorous. I mean, just the way that it is written, the phrases and everything, it is amazing. That's what the King James Version really is. It is a piece of art. And as much as you might hear me disparage it from time to time or say things against it, and I do for reasons that we'll eventually get to, I don't for this reason. The King James Version is still the most beautiful translation of the Bible in the English language. And I do not believe in any way that it will ever be paralleled or overdone in that way. It is the most melodic and beautiful translation, if not the most beautiful writing ever in the English language, surpassing anything else that has been written. In that book, Wide as the Waters, that I keep referencing, they provide pages of phrases that the King James Version has, where it took what was there in the Bishop's Bible or some of the other ones, and then you can see it, they tweaked it ever so slightly, and it just pops off the page in a way that it didn't before. So even so, perhaps one of the greatest testament to the translators is when there were times that prior translations got it right, they didn't feel the need to change it. They said, that turn of phrase is good. That's a good translation, and it sounds good. We're going to use it. Every translation of the Bible that we have talked about, some suggest even part of the Douay-Rheims, every translation, even Wycliffe, every translation that we've talked about has something in the King James Version that originated in that translation. Some piece of every English Bible leading up to the King James Version is there in the King James Version somewhere. I think that is a huge testament to the translation committee. And so the translation work itself was finished by 1608. They had to then get to revision. There was a very specific translation committee that it then had to go to, even though it'd been through every company and they'd all looked at it. Now there was a group of 15 people who were tasked, and these are people who have been part of the translation work. They are tasked with giving the very final review of the translation. After this was done, they were supposed to give it in to final review, and we don't know much of what took place in these meetings. In fact, we knew nothing until 1958 when somebody unearthed some notes from a part of the meeting to at least give us an idea of what was taking place the whole time. But interestingly, unexpectedly, a guy named Richard Bancroft, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, he said, I have final revision preference, I guess you could say. He came in, he wasn't part of the committee. He walked in and said, I get the final say, and he made 14 changes. We only know what one of them was. One of them was to use the word bishopric in Acts chapter 1 and verse 20, instead of maybe office. Trying to remember what the other was, but he changed it to bishopric, wanting to maintain the high church language of bishop and bishopric and such things as that. So he comes in and he has final say, but that's all that we know about that. The initial printings in 1611 were as beautiful as the text was sonorous and They carried some attributes from earlier Bibles, such as the Bishops, the Great Bible. I think I do need to at least controversy that came from the accidental printing of what's called the Wicked Bible. Anybody ever heard of the Wicked Bible before? One of the very early printings of the King James Version that left out the word not from the seventh commandment. And that was a major issue and cost that printer quite a bit. So it said, "Thou shalt commit adultery," in case you don't remember what the seventh commandment was. Therefore, it was termed the Wicked Bible, is what they called it. But that wasn't the only problem. It was not initially met, well by everybody. The Puritans, as good as everything was, the Puritans still had some problems with it. They saw there was too much high church Anglican discussion or translation in it. They would have loved to have been able to remove the idea of bishops as bishops were, because they gave the idea of the system from the papacy that was just a part of the church. So remember words like church, charity, other things that the Geneva Bible was very careful to say, hey, let's use these words correctly instead of the way that we've been using them. Well, this didn't do that. There were still statements like, Bancroft put in there about the bishop. The marginal notes were lacking because there was nothing about how bad the papacy was in the marginal notes. There was nothing about how much you needed to get rid of this or get rid of that. There was nothing inflammatory in the marginal notes. They loved their good Geneva Bible. Because in the good Geneva Bible, you could read all the commentary in the margins that tells you how bad anything and everything is that doesn't agree with what we agree. And you have those. And they weren't there in the King James Version. They preferred their good old Geneva Bibles. It's what they'd been using for over 40 years. And it was just fine with them. Why change? It was just a good translation. In fact, interestingly enough, even some Puritan preachers, even some translators of the King James Version continued in their teaching and preaching to use the Geneva Bible. They did so because that's what the people were familiar with. That's what they'd grown up using. That's what they'd memorized their verses in. And even if you have something better at hand, why would you change it when this is what everybody knows? But all that does is further perpetuate the problem of people continuing to use what is now an inferior product, and they will learn it in this, and they will grow up using this, and they will learn it by knowing all of these things and having their verses memorized in this, and they'll say, well, we'll just keep using the Geneva Bible instead of going to the King James, because of its popularity. So it only further perpetuates that system, and it took a while for that to get out. And then you had some dissenters like a guy named John Selden and a guy named Hugh Broughton. Hugh Broughton, who was just a cantankerous old man. I don't know if he was old. He was just very cantankerous. And he reminds me a lot of the way that Jerome was described. Absolutely brilliant, but couldn't get along with people. And he probably could have been a huge part of this, except nobody liked him. So there was no way they were going to put him on any of the committees because he couldn't work with people. And so just a huge, brilliant mind that didn't have a part to play in this. All right, with the few minutes we have, let's talk about the legacy of the King James Version. It was never actually officially authorized. We call it the Authorized Version. That's what it's called. But there was never some kind of act of parliament or a decree from the king or something like that by which it says, this is now the Authorized Version. But it was generally understood to be that. Even so, with everything that we've stated about the King James Version tonight, as much as I have talked about how incredible it is, let me suggest to you, I have understated its importance and how amazing this monumental work is. there is no way that I can convey just how incredible and how monumental and how important in history the King James Version is. It is the most important literary work that has ever been produced in the English language, that will ever be produced, I believe, in the English language. If we're talking about from a literary standpoint, here's a quotation from a guy, Thomas Macaulay. He says, "If everything else in our language should perish, the King James Version would alone suffice to show the world the extent of the English language's beauty and power." In other words, if everything about the English language goes away and all that is left is the King James Version for someone to pick up and say, I wonder what this English language is all about, it would do the trick. And it would convey just how magnificent the English language is. It is the greatest piece of English literature that has ever been produced. Oh, and by the way, it is the Bible. It is such an amazing thing. It has been in the public sphere in so many ways. It's a part of the way that people think, speak, write. It just has been in the public imagination for centuries. Works such as Paradise Lost, Pilgrim's Progress, even the Gettysburg Address, and so many other writings in the English language through the years have shown off the beauty of the King James Version. Its legacy has lasted so much that it has been the dominant translation in living memory. That there are so many people alive who can remember when it was basically the only real translation that's used. It has been dethroned now as the greatest in sales or our usage or things like that. But that's only a very, very recent thing that has taken place. We are over 400 years since this writing was done. And it is still among the top as far as dominance of Bibles with the English language. That is an incredible feat. Most people of a certain age have your memory verses memorized from the King James Version. How many of you guys memorize verses with the King James? Yeah. That says an awful lot. Many books still use it to quote from. Having said all that, there is a reason why in the past few decades it has dropped from the top spot of dominance and is probably going to continue. And much of that has to do with a lot of the scholarship that was set in motion in the 19th century. And that is going to be the basis of what we'll get into next week. All right. Thanks a lot, guys. Appreciate the class and the opportunity to talk about the King James Version with you.